In the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, 1887, a small frontier town called Copper Ridge stood as a testament to human resilience against the unforgiving wilderness. The town consisted of barely 20 wooden structures, a saloon, a general store, and a makeshift sheriff's office. Most inhabitants were miners, ranch hands, and drifters seeking fortune or escape from their pasts. Among them was a man known simply as Jacob Reed, a quiet cowboy who worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences, tending horses, and doing whatever work came his way for meager pay. Jacob was not an imposing figure. Standing at average height with a lean frame that suggested more hardship than strength, he moved through town with his head down and spoke only when necessary. His clothes were worn and patched, his boots cracked from years of use, and his hat had seen better days decades ago. The townspeople regarded him with a mixture of pity and dismissal. To them, he was just another drifter too weak or too broken to make anything of himself. Children would sometimes mock him as he passed, and the local ranch owners would offer him the jobs no one else wanted, paying him less than they'd pay anyone else, knowing he'd accept without complaint. What the people of Copper Ridge didn't know was that Jacob Reed carried a history that would have changed everything about how they treated him. 20 years earlier, when Jacob was barely 17, he had been part of a wagon train heading west when they were ambushed by a group of bandits. The attack was brutal and swift. Jacob's family and most of the travelers were killed, and Jacob himself was left for dead with a bullet wound in his shoulder. He managed to crawl away from the massacre site, delirious with pain and loss of blood, expecting to die alone in the desert. It was an Apache hunting party that found him 3 days later. By all accounts and the tensions of the time, Jacob should have been killed immediately or left to die. But the leader of that hunting party, a warrior named Nalnish, saw something in the young man's eyes, something that reminded him of his own son who had died the previous winter. Against the counsel of some in his group, Nalnish ordered Jacob to be taken back to their camp. For 6 months, Jacob lived among the Apache. They nursed him back to health, and during his recovery, something remarkable happened. Jacob didn't see enemies or savages as he'd been taught to see them. He saw people, families, children playing, elders telling stories, warriors training, women working together and laughing. He learned their language, their customs, their deep connection to the land. He learned to track, to read the desert, to move silently, to survive where others would perish. More importantly, he learned their values of honor, courage, and loyalty to one's people. When it came time for Jacob to leave, Nalnish performed a ceremony that bound Jacob as a friend to their band. 77 warriors placed their marks on a hide as witnesses to this bond, each one pledging that Jacob would always have their friendship and protection. Nalnish gave Jacob a small medicine pouch with specific markings that would identify him to any Apache who understood its significance. Jacob wore it always hidden under his shirt, close to his heart. But Jacob never spoke of this time. The world he returned to wouldn't understand. White settlers feared and hated the Apache, and the Apache had every reason to distrust white men who continued to push them from their lands. Jacob found himself caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. So he drifted, keeping his head down, speaking little, trying to find peace in anonymity. In Copper Ridge, trouble had been brewing for months. A wealthy rancher named Clayton Vance had arrived with big plans and bigger ambitions. He owned the largest spread in the territory, and wanted to expand even further. The problem was that his desired expansion would push into territory that was technically Apache land according to old treaties. Vance didn't care about treaties. He had money, hired guns, and the ear of corrupt officials who would look the other way. Vance had brought with him a group of 20 hired gunmen, each one meaner than the last. They terrorized the town, drinking heavily, starting fights, and making it clear that Copper Ridge was now Vance's town. The sheriff, an aging man named Tom Brooker, was powerless against them. When he tried to stand up to Vance's men, they beat him so badly he could barely walk. The townspeople were terrified into submission. Jacob watched all of this unfold with growing concern. He saw the fear in people's eyes, saw how the hired guns pushed everyone around, saw how Vance's plans would inevitably lead to conflict with the Apache, which would mean more death on both sides. Still, he said nothing. What could one weak cowboy do against 20 armed killers? Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Vance's men decided to have some fun with a young Apache woman who had come to town to trade. She was now Nisha's granddaughter, though Jacob didn't know this at first. 3 of Vance's men surrounded her outside the general store, grabbing at her, laughing at her fear, making crude suggestions about what they planned to do with her. Jacob was across the street when he heard the commotion. He saw the girl's face, saw the terror and defiance mixed together, and something inside him snapped. All the years of keeping quiet, of accepting abuse, of watching injustice and doing nothing, it all came to an end in that moment. He walked straight toward the 3 men. "Leave her alone," Jacob said quietly. His voice didn't shake, didn't rise, but it carried a weight that made the men pause. The 3 gunmen turned to look at this skinny cowboy in threadbare clothes daring to tell them what to do. For a moment, they were so surprised they didn't know how to react. Then they started laughing. "You gonna make us scarecrow?" the biggest one said, his hand moving toward his gun. Jacob didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one. Instead, he stepped between the men and the girl. "I'm asking you nice. Let her go, and we'll forget this happened." The laughter died. Now the men were angry. The big one shoved Jacob hard, sending him stumbling backward. "You got a death wish, boy? Mr. Vance don't like people interfering with his men's fun." A crowd had gathered now. Townspeople watching from doorways and windows, too afraid to help but unable to look away. The young Apache woman looked at Jacob with confusion and hope mixed together. She didn't understand why this white man would risk himself for her. Then one of the gunmen noticed the leather pouch hanging from Jacob's neck, exposed when his shirt got torn during the shove. The man reached out and yanked it free, breaking the cord. He held it up, examining the markings. "What's this? Some kind of Indian trinket? You friends with the savages, Scarecrow?" Jacob's face went pale, not with fear but with the realization that everything was about to change. "Give that back," he said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge sharp as any blade. The gunman threw the pouch in the dirt and ground it under his boot. "Ain't worth nothing anyway. Just like you." What happened next became legend in Copper Ridge. Jacob moved with a speed and skill that seemed impossible from someone who'd appeared so weak and harmless. He ducked under the big man's clumsy punch, struck him precisely in the throat, swept his legs, and had him gasping in the dirt before anyone could react. The second man drew his gun, but Jacob was already moving, using techniques he'd learned from Apache warriors 20 years ago. Within 30 seconds, all 3 of Vance's hired guns were on the ground, disarmed and groaning in pain. The young Apache woman stared at Jacob in amazement. Then she saw the pouch in the dirt, saw the specific markings on it, and her eyes went wide with recognition. She picked it up carefully, examining it closely, then looked at Jacob with new understanding. She spoke in Apache, asking if he was the one her grandfather had told stories about, the white man who had been honored by their band. Jacob replied in fluent Apache, asking her name and telling her to leave town quickly before more of Vance's men came. But it was too late for that. The commotion had drawn attention, and within minutes, Clayton Vance himself arrived with his remaining 17 hired guns. Vance was a tall man with cold eyes and an expensive suit that looked absurd in the dusty frontier town. He surveyed the scene, his 3 men still on the ground, and fixed his gaze on Jacob. "You made a serious mistake, friend. I was going to let you live your pathetic little life, but now you've embarrassed my men, interfered with my business, and made me look weak. Can't have that." He nodded to his gunmen, and they began to spread out, forming a semicircle around Jacob and the Apache girl. The townspeople scattered, running for cover, knowing what was about to happen. Sheriff Brooker tried to intervene, but one of the gunmen knocked him down with a rifle butt. Jacob stood calmly, showing no fear, which seemed to unsettle Vance. "This girl is under my protection," Jacob said clearly. "She leaves safely, or none of you leave at all." This declaration was met with laughter from the hired guns. One weak cowboy against 18 armed killers? It was absurd. Vance smiled cruelly. "Big words from a dead man. Tell you what though. I'm feeling generous today. You got 1 minute to say your prayers before my boys turn you into Swiss cheese." What Clayton Vance and his men didn't see was the dust cloud rising in the distance. What they didn't hear was the thunder of hooves approaching at full gallop. What they didn't know was that when the Apache girl had come to town that morning, she hadn't come alone. Her escort of warriors had been waiting at a respectful distance outside town, as was their custom when trading. And what absolutely no one in Copper Ridge could have known was that when those warriors saw their young woman being accosted, saw this strange white cowboy defend her, saw him speaking their language and carrying the sacred medicine pouch with marks they recognized, they sent out a call that spread across the desert like wildfire, bringing together Apache warriors from multiple bands, all connected by blood or honor to that ceremony 20 years ago when they had pledged friendship to a young white man named Jacob Reed. The first sign Vance's men had that something was wrong was when the Apache girl smiled. Then came the war cries, echoing off the buildings, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The hired guns spun around, trying to find the source, hands going to their weapons, fear beginning to replace their confidence. They rode into Copper Ridge like an unstoppable force of nature. 77 Apache warriors on horseback, the same 77 who had placed their marks on that hide 2 decades ago. Though some were older now and a few were sons taking their fathers' places. They surrounded Vance's men completely, rifles and spears raised, faces painted for war, creating a scene that would be burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. At the front rode Nalnish, now an old man but still powerful and commanding. He stopped his horse directly in front of Jacob, looked down at him with eyes that showed both recognition and respect, and spoke in Apache for all to hear, declaring that this man was friend and brother to their people, that any harm to him would be answered with blood. Clayton Vance's face had gone white as snow. His hired guns, so confident moments before, now looked terrified, surrounded by warriors who could end them all in seconds. The power dynamic had shifted so completely and suddenly that the change itself was almost surreal. Jacob picked up his medicine pouch from the dirt, brushed it off, and placed it back around his neck. Then he turned to Vance. "I believe the lady was about to complete her trading and leave town peacefully. I suggest you and your men don't interfere with that." What else could Vance do? He nodded mutely, and his men backed away. The young Apache woman completed her business at the general store, took her goods, thanked Jacob and Apache, and rode off safely with her escort. But the warriors didn't leave immediately. Nalnish dismounted and embraced Jacob like a long-lost son. They spoke quietly in Apache while the entire town watched in amazement. Finally, Nalnish remounted, gave one last warning look to Vance and his men, and led his warriors out of town. The silence that followed their departure was profound. Everyone stared at Jacob, this weak cowboy they thought they knew, seeing him now as someone completely different. Clayton Vance quietly packed up his operation and left Copper Ridge that very evening, taking his hired guns with him, knowing he'd pushed into the wrong territory and made an enemy of the wrong man. In the days that followed, Jacob's life in Copper Ridge changed dramatically. People treated him with respect, even awe. The sheriff offered him a deputy badge. Ranch owners offered him top positions. But Jacob turned them all down. He didn't want fame or special treatment. He'd only wanted to do the right thing when someone needed help. He did accept when the town asked him to serve as a liaison between Copper Ridge and the Apache bands in the region. It was a role he was uniquely suited for, someone trusted by both sides, someone who could prevent misunderstandings from becoming conflicts. And in that role, Jacob finally found his purpose, no longer caught between two worlds but serving as a bridge between them. The townspeople never forgot the day they learned that the weak cowboy they'd dismissed and pitted was actually friends with 77 Apache warriors. It became a story passed down through generations. A reminder that you never really know someone's story, that strength comes in many forms, and that the quiet, humble person you overlook might be the most extraordinary person you'll ever meet.